I never thought it would come to this. Standing here in the living room of the house that had once been my sanctuary, I couldn't help but feel the cold, suffocating weight of betrayal crushing me from all sides. Just weeks after burying my mother, the woman who had been my everything, my father, 54 years old, introduced me to his new fiancée, Megan, a woman barely older than me. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, what came next shattered whatever small sense of security I'd clung to in the aftermath of my mother's death. "We're getting married next month," he announced, as if nothing had changed, as if his long marriage to my mother hadn't just ended in heartbreak and loss, as if the woman who had just died after fighting a long, grueling battle with cancer didn't deserve at least a few months of mourning before he replaced her. But here was Megan smiling at me, as if I should be happy for them, as if I should be happy that my father, who had never treated me with the care or affection I needed, was now moving on so quickly, like a lovesick teenager. And then came the ultimatum. He looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes, the same eyes that had never once shown me the love I'd craved all my life, and said it. "If you don't attend the wedding, you'll be cut out of my will. No inheritance, no future." I froze. The words felt like a slap, like a cruel joke that only I was meant to suffer. A wedding. A celebration of what? The end of my family? The erasure of my mother's memory? And for what? A young woman who, for all I knew, was only interested in my father's money, a woman barely old enough to be my friend, let alone my stepmother. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that he was so heartlessly moving on so quickly, or the fact that he was trying to manipulate me with something as hollow as his inheritance, my inheritance. The one thing that had always been promised to me, the one thing that gave me a sense of security in this broken world. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him how disgusting this was, how cruel it felt to have my mother's memory so callously discarded. But I couldn't, because if I did, I would lose everything. I would lose not just my father, but the one thing I'd been clinging to for years, the promise of a future. I couldn't let that happen. But I didn't know if I could live with the choice I was about to make. I had no idea how this would end, but I knew one thing for certain. Life would never be the same again. Growing up, I always felt like an outsider in my own family. My name is Natalie, and I'm 28 years old. I've spent most of my life trying to make sense of the emotional chaos that surrounded me. My dad, a successful businessman, never really knew how to be a father. And my mother, well, she was the one who carried us both. But even she couldn't shield me from the constant tension that existed between my parents. My dad had a complicated relationship with his family. When he and my mom first met, they were young, just starting their lives together. My mom was from a modest background, humble, hardworking, and my dad's family, well, they were everything she wasn't. Wealthy, status-driven, and cold. They never accepted her, not really. They accused her of being a gold digger, of only being with my dad for his money, and that was enough for him to turn his back on them. He chose her, of course, but that decision came with its own price. It was as if the rejection from his family planted a seed in him, one that began to grow with every passing year, slowly consuming him from within. I grew up in a home where love was never really present. Sure, my parents stayed together, but their marriage was built on resentment, on unspoken words, and silent battles. By the time I was old enough to understand, my dad and mom had stopped communicating completely. They slept in separate rooms, hardly spoke except when they argued. I spent my childhood tiptoeing around the house, listening to the yelling behind closed doors, trying to pretend that everything was normal when I knew it wasn't. But my mom, she was different. She tried, with every ounce of her being, to make things better. She was the glue that held us together, the one who showered me with affection and love that I craved from my father. She would take me to the park, to ice cream shops, anything to distract me from the tension in the house. I remember how she would pull me into her arms after one of Dad's tirades, kissing my forehead and whispering that everything would be okay. She was my rock, the only person who ever truly understood me. Even when I was older, I could see how much she tried to protect me from the worst of my father's behavior. I remember one particular argument when I was a teenager. Dad was furious because I had a slightly lower grade than he expected. My mom stood up to him for the first time in years, trying to defend me. But instead of listening, Dad turned his anger on her, calling her useless, telling her she had failed as a mother, And then, in the blink of an eye, he directed that anger at me, belittling everything I did, crushing my every attempt to succeed. But I didn't let him break me. Not entirely. I knew my worth. I had to. My mom made sure of that. Even when my father refused to see me for who I truly was, she would remind me every day that I was strong, that I was capable. I held on to that belief as tightly as I could, using it to get through the worst parts of my childhood. When I left for college, I thought it would be the escape I had always dreamed of. A fresh start. A chance to breathe without the constant tension of my parents fighting, suffocating me. I threw myself into my studies, into new friendships, into everything that was far removed from the toxic home I had left behind. But even then, my father's shadow loomed over me. He still called me with demands, still expected me to be his emotional support, even though I was trying to live my own life. That was when I met Robbie. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, but life has a way of throwing curveballs. Robbie was a classmate, someone I met at a party in my second year of college. We were both a bit lost, both looking for a sense of direction. We were drawn to each other, not because of some fairy tale romance, but because we were both escaping something. We weren't in love, not really, but we found comfort in each other's arms. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. I had always thought I would finish school first, build my career, get my life on track. But life doesn't always follow your plans. Robbie was surprisingly supportive, but he wasn't ready for a family. He had his own future to think about, and I had mine. But when I told my mom, she didn't hesitate. She took me in, supported me without question, even though it wasn't easy for her either. She told me that this was my life now, but she would be there for me no matter what. Gemma was born in the winter, and the moment I held her, I knew my life had changed forever. But even then, I wasn't free from the weight of my past. My dad didn't acknowledge Gemma's birth the way he should have. He barely acknowledged me at all. He was too wrapped up in his own life, too focused on his business. But my mom was there, always there, reminding me of my worth. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would be the start of something new. But instead, I found myself facing the harsh reality that my father was still the same man. The man who had never loved me the way a father should. The man who, even as I struggled, demanded I support him financially, as if I owed him for everything he'd ever done. And that's where the story truly begins. As Gemma grew, so did the realization that my life was anything but stable. Robbie, despite his initial promises, began to drift away. He got busy with his new job, and the visits became less frequent. I was grateful for the time we did share, but it wasn't the same. As the months passed, I started to see the cracks in my own life, cracks that I'd been trying so hard to ignore. My parents' financial situation was worse than I'd realized. It felt like every time I turned around, there was another bill, another debt, another emergency that required my help. I had no choice but to support them. My father's long list of financial failures had put a massive strain on the entire family, and now that I was back home with Gemma, I was expected to contribute. At first, it started small. I helped with groceries, with the electricity bill, with whatever my parents needed. But soon, it became an expectation. I was giving up more of my paycheck every month. The credit card payments, the student loans, the never-ending requests for money to cover their expenses. It felt like I was drowning, but there was no way out. I didn't have the luxury of saying no. Every time I tried, my father reminded me of everything they had done for me, raising me, supporting me when I was struggling with alcoholism, getting me through school. He made sure I knew that I owed them, that I had to pay them back. But the more I gave, the more they took. It was a vicious cycle that I didn't know how to escape. It wasn't until I got that job offer from the marketing company that I saw a potential way out. It was a remote position, allowing me to work from anywhere. The pay was more than I had ever dreamed of. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to start fresh, to finally take control of my life, to be close to Gemma. But there was one problem. I couldn't leave, not without my parents' permission. I knew they would never let me go. The guilt, the constant reminders of how much I owed them weighed heavily on me. They had been my rock, but now they were using that rock to keep me chained to their needs, their demands, their financial failures. I had been toying with the idea of moving to Michigan for months, but I couldn't bear the thought of leaving them to fend for themselves. And so I did what I thought would ease my conscience. I told them I was going to visit my brother, Jake, in Michigan. They didn't question me at first. They were too caught up in their own problems to see it for what it was, an escape. I packed my bags and left, just like that. It wasn't easy, not by any means. The guilt gnawed at me every step of the way. I knew I was doing the right thing for Gemma, for me, but leaving felt like a betrayal. I had promised my parents I would always be there for them, and now I was walking away from that promise. I arrived in Michigan, told Jake my plan, and accepted the job offer. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but it wasn't long before the calls started coming. My father's angry voice on the other end of the line, accusing me of abandoning them. My mother's pleading, reminding me of everything they had done for me. The guilt was overwhelming. I had to make a decision. Should I stay and continue to support them, sacrificing my own happiness and future? Or should I finally put myself first and build a life outside the shadow of their demands? I chose to stay. I chose to take the job and focus on rebuilding my relationship with Gemma, on finally building something for myself. But the consequences of that decision were far from over. It didn't take long for the consequences of my decision to come crashing down on me. The first few weeks in Michigan were a blur. I settled into Jake's guest room and started my new remote job. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. But every time I opened my phone, the messages from my parents were waiting for me. The guilt trips, the accusations. They kept telling me how selfish I was, how I had abandoned them when they needed me most. They didn't seem to care that I had my own life to rebuild. I was their safety net, and they made it clear they didn't want to lose that. Then, a few weeks after I arrived in Michigan, something happened that changed everything. I got a call from Robbie. He was cautious but kind, asking how I was doing, how Gemma was adjusting to me being away. The conversation felt normal, almost like we were reconnecting in a way we hadn't in years. But then he dropped a bombshell. He told me that Gemma had been asking about me more and more. She was missing me, and Robbie thought it would be a good idea if I came to see her. It was a generous offer, but there was more beneath the surface. Robbie had an ulterior motive. He wanted me to sign an agreement, a custody agreement. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. We hadn't discussed custody formally. I'd been staying with my parents, and Gemma had been living with Robbie in Michigan. We'd agreed to the original visitation plan, but now he was suggesting a more permanent arrangement. He wanted Gemma to spend most of her time with him. He wanted full custody, or at least joint custody, with her living primarily in Michigan. I was stunned. My heart sank into my stomach. I had always known that my situation was precarious. I didn't have a job that could support me fully, let alone support Gemma. I didn't have a stable home of my own, but I never expected this. I thought Robbie understood. I thought he knew how important it was for me to be involved in Gemma's life. I thought we were a team. The legal papers he sent me didn't just ask for joint custody. They demanded that I sign away any claim to Gemma's care. It felt like a cold, calculated move to take away the one thing I had left. The one thing that had kept me going through all the pain and chaos, my daughter. I called a lawyer. It was my only option. I couldn't risk losing Gemma. She was my world. The lawyer said I had to prepare for a custody battle. Given my lack of financial stability, the court might rule in Robbie's favor. He had a steady job, a home, and family support. What did I have? A remote job and an apartment I couldn't afford without my parents' help. I called my parents, expecting them to support me, to be on my side, to tell me not to worry. But instead, I was met with silence. My father's voice, cold as ever, told me that it was my responsibility to make things work with Robbie. My mother didn't speak up, just whispered that I should be grateful Robbie was offering to take care of Gemma. It was like they were washing their hands of me too, leaving me to fight this battle alone. The guilt was suffocating. How could I fight for Gemma when I didn't even have a stable foundation? How could I ask her to live with me when I couldn't offer her anything more than a small apartment and a new job? But then came the turning point, the moment I realized I couldn't back down. I had to fight, not just for my daughter, but for myself. I wasn't going to let Robbie take her away from me, no matter how hard it got. I went to see Gemma that weekend, against the weight of everything. Seeing her smile when I walked into her room, hearing her excited chatter about her day, it filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't known in years. I knew then that I would do whatever it took to keep my family together, whatever it took to prove I was a mother who deserved to be in her child's life. But even as I embraced her and promised to always be there for her, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The days that followed that visit with Gemma were a blur. I was torn between the overwhelming joy of seeing my daughter and the crushing anxiety of what was coming. Robbie's custody papers were still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it all wasn't right. I had been a part of her life for the first few years, had been her rock, just as my mom had been to me. How could I let this man take her from me? How could I allow my daughter to grow up in a home where I wasn't around every day? But the truth was, I didn't have much of a choice. The lawyer had explained the situation clearly. Unless I could prove I was in a stable financial position and capable of providing for Gemma, the court was likely to side with Robbie. He had the upper hand. The law often favored the parent who could offer security, and right now, I couldn't offer her that. I felt trapped. All my life, I'd been trying to break free of the expectations others had for me, expectations set by my father, my family, society. Now I was facing a new set of constraints. I had to fight for my daughter's future, but I didn't know how to win when it felt like the odds were stacked against me. The guilt from leaving my parents and moving to Michigan started to eat at me. I had left them behind, yes, but they had been the ones to make me feel like I owed them, like I had to sacrifice everything just to keep them from falling apart. I couldn't go back now, not after everything that had happened. But could I keep Gemma? Could I raise her alone when I barely had enough money to pay for my rent? I hadn't even been able to save for her future. How could I promise her the world when my own foundation was so shaky? I spent hours thinking about the choices I had made, the decisions that had led me here, the long conversations I'd had with Robbie, the promises I made to Gemma before I left, the uncertainty of my future. Each thought felt like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Then the message came. It was from my mother. She hadn't called me in weeks, but when her name flashed across the screen, I hesitated. "Hi, honey. I just wanted to let you know that your father's been talking to a lawyer. He's planning to take you to court over the inheritance. If you don't agree to attend the wedding and accept Megan, he's going to make sure you don't get a cent. And, well, we're in trouble here. I don't know how much longer we can keep the house without your help." The words stung. I had expected this in some way. My father was ruthless when it came to money, and I was nothing more than a pawn in his game. But hearing it from my mother, from the woman I had always turned to for support, made me feel more alone than ever. I didn't know how to respond. How could I possibly focus on my own fight for Gemma when my parents were threatening to drag me back into their mess? How could I stand up to my father when it felt like I had no solid ground to stand on? I felt a momentary sense of panic. I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to face this, to deal with both my past and the future I wanted to build with Gemma. Every time I thought I had a hold on things, the ground shifted beneath me. But then I thought of Gemma again. Her smile, her laughter, her sweet little hands gripping mine tightly when we played. She needed me. She needed me to be strong. So I made the decision. I wasn't going to let Robbie's lawyers intimidate me, and I wasn't going to let my father's manipulation ruin the chance to build a life with my daughter. I had to fight, not just for the inheritance, but for my dignity, for my future, and for the life I wanted to create for Gemma. But that didn't mean it was going to be easy. The next morning, I called a family meeting with my lawyer. We needed to strategize. I had to fight for Gemma's future, no matter how daunting the road ahead seemed. I knew that it was going to be an uphill battle, but I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not after everything I had been through. The lawyer assured me that I had options. If I could show that Robbie's offer wasn't in Gemma's best interests, if I could prove that I was the one who truly understood what she needed, then there was still hope. It wasn't just about money. It was about stability, emotional bonds, and the future I could offer her. But even as we made our plans, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was once again walking into a battle I had little control over. I went to see Gemma again that weekend. I spent hours with her at a park near Robbie's house, watching her run and play. And as I sat there, listening to her giggles, I realized something. I had already won. I had her. And as long as I kept fighting for her, I would never lose her again. But the battle wasn't over. The weeks that followed felt like a constant fight, a never-ending string of legal meetings, tense phone calls, and moments of self-doubt. Every day seemed like a battle. The pressure from Robbie and his lawyers mounted. They were relentless in their attempts to push for custody, trying to make me seem unfit as a mother. Their strategy was clear: make me feel like I had no choice but to comply, to surrender Gemma to a life where I couldn't be her primary caretaker. Robbie's lawyer, a smooth-talking, well-dressed man who always seemed one step ahead, had been making every effort to paint me as an unreliable parent. They had gathered evidence that I didn't have a full-time job, that my apartment was small, and that I was struggling financially. They used every bit of information they could find to undermine my ability to care for Gemma. My lawyer tried to reassure me, telling me that they didn't have enough to prove that I wasn't fit to be Gemma's mother. But the more I heard about Robbie's case, the more I began to wonder if I had what it took to win. Every piece of evidence they presented seemed like a punch to the gut. The pressure of it all made my chest tight, my breathing shallow. I knew I couldn't back down. I couldn't let Robbie take Gemma away from me. But I also knew that I was fighting not just for her future, but for my own. It wasn't just about being a mother anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of standing up for what was mine, for what I had fought for all these years. The legal process started to drag on, each meeting more grueling than the last. Every time Robbie sent me a message, it was another reminder of how far he was willing to go to control me, to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He would send me messages asking about Gemma's health, about her schooling, about her favorite foods. It seemed innocent at first, but I soon realized it was just a way to gather information he could use against me. Then came the final blow. During one of our meetings, Robbie's lawyer presented a set of photos they'd taken of Gemma with me. They were recent pictures, taken during our visits, and they were carefully selected to show me in moments of weakness. One of the photos was of me sitting on the couch, looking exhausted after a long day. My hair was disheveled, and I was half sitting, half lying, with Gemma curled up beside me. The photo made me look like I was struggling, like I couldn't handle the responsibility of motherhood. Robbie's lawyer tried to use the photo as evidence of my inability to maintain a stable environment for Gemma. He pointed to my tired eyes, the way I was slumped on the couch, and used it as a symbol of my supposed instability. It was a cheap tactic, but it hurt. It made me feel small, like all the effort I had put into raising Gemma wasn't enough, like my exhaustion was being used against me. I wanted to lash out. I wanted to yell at them, tell them how hard I had worked to get where I was, how much I had sacrificed to provide for Gemma. But I didn't. I kept my cool, even when my heart was racing in my chest. I couldn't afford to lose control. The tension at home was getting worse. Every time I picked up my phone, there was another message from my parents. They were angry, frustrated, and desperate. They were asking for more money, telling me they couldn't survive without my help. They were falling apart, and I could feel the weight of their expectations bearing down on me. Every time I tried to focus on my own life, they reminded me of the promises I had made. They reminded me of everything they had done for me. It felt like I was being torn in two directions, one pulling me toward the life I wanted to build with Gemma, and the other pulling me back to the suffocating demands of my parents. I couldn't ignore them. I couldn't let them fall apart. But at the same time, I had to protect Gemma. I couldn't let them drag me back into the toxic cycle of guilt and obligation. The phone calls, the messages, the constant demands, everything was starting to blur together. I felt like I was losing my grip. My lawyer said I needed to stay strong, stay focused on the goal. But how could I focus when everything around me was crumbling? I called my mom one night just to check in. I wanted to hear her voice, to feel like I wasn't completely alone in all of this. She was quiet at first, and then she told me something that made my stomach twist. "Natalie, your father, he's been talking to his family again, the one he cut off when he married your mom. He's been meeting with them, and they've been asking about you. They want to help." The words didn't make sense. My father had shut them out for years, refused to let me know anything about them. Now, after all these years, they were back, and they were asking about me? "I don't know what to think," my mom continued, her voice shaking, "but it seems like he's trying to make amends. He wants to help us, Natalie. He's trying to make things right." I couldn't believe it. After everything, after his cruelty, after all the lies, after the way he had treated me and my mother for years, he was trying to come back into my life, trying to make things right. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Confusion? I didn't trust him. I couldn't. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that his family had resources. They could help us in ways I couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, this could be the chance to finally break free from my father's toxic hold on me. But at what cost? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't keep running from my past. It was time to face it head on. If I was going to move forward with Gemma, if I was going to build a better life for us, I had to confront everything: my father, my parents' demands, and the mess I had been trying to escape for so long. The fight for Gemma's future wasn't just about proving I could be a better mother. It was about proving I could be strong enough to finally stand up to the people who had kept me in their shadows for too long. I couldn't let them control my future anymore. The mediation was coming up soon, and this time I wasn't going to let them break me. I thought I was ready. I thought I had everything under control. But as the date of the mediation approached, I could feel the walls closing in. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, and the pressure was unbearable. I couldn't stop thinking about the stakes. Gemma's future, my future, everything we had built together now hanging in the balance. And yet, despite all the preparation, despite everything I had told myself, I still found myself doubting my own worth. Was I really enough? Was I really capable of fighting for her against all these forces? The night before the mediation, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the photos of Gemma and me that lined my walls. I traced my fingers over the edges of her smiling face, trying to hold on to that feeling of love and joy we had shared during our visits. I thought about how she'd clung to me that first time I saw her after leaving Ohio, her little hands gripping mine as though she was afraid I'd disappear again. I promised her I would never leave her, but now, in the face of all this, I felt like I was breaking that promise. The texts from Robbie's lawyer kept coming, each one more demanding than the last. They were trying to force me into a corner, to make me feel like I had no choice but to give in to their demands. But I had to stand my ground. I couldn't let them take her away from me. Still, doubt crept in. I kept asking myself if I was doing the right thing. Was I being too stubborn? Maybe if I just let her go, if I just agreed to their terms, things would be easier for all of us. Maybe Robbie would let me see her on weekends. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe he wouldn't be so angry with me. Maybe, just maybe, I could have a peaceful life again. But as those thoughts swirled in my head, something shifted inside me. I realized, with a jolt, that if I gave in now, if I let Robbie take control of this situation, I would be losing more than just custody of my daughter. I would be losing everything I had fought for, the life I had built after leaving Ohio, the strength I had found in myself after years of neglect and emotional abuse from my father. I couldn't let myself go back to that place. But even with this realization, I still felt terrified. I had never felt this powerless before. Every day felt like a struggle just to keep my head above water. And when I thought about the mediation tomorrow, about sitting across from Robbie, facing the lawyer, facing the cold, sterile conference room, it was like the weight of the world was crashing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't focus. I picked up my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed my mother. She hadn't been much support lately. Every time I reached out, she seemed to distance herself more and more, absorbed in her own guilt and worries. But I needed her. I needed someone to tell me it was going to be okay, someone to reassure me that I was doing the right thing, that I was strong enough. She picked up on the second ring. "Mom," I said, my voice unsteady, "I'm scared." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I know," she finally said softly. "I know you are, and I'm so sorry for all of this. But Natalie, you have to fight for Gemma. You can't let them take her from you. You've been her mother from the start, and you can't let anyone, no matter how much money or power they have, take that away." Her words, simple as they were, grounded me. I took a deep breath and wiped away the tears I hadn't realized had started to fall. My mom was right. I couldn't let this man who had abandoned me and my mother for years, take away the one thing I truly loved. But even as I heard her words of encouragement, a small part of me wondered if I could handle what was coming next. Would I have the strength to face Robbie's lawyer, to stand tall in the face of his manipulations? Would I be able to protect Gemma from everything she didn't yet understand? The next morning, I arrived at the mediation office early. The lobby was cold, sterile, and filled with too many chairs. I sat in the corner, trying to steady my breathing. The silence around me was suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I felt as though I might crumble under the pressure at any moment. When Robbie and his lawyer walked in, my heart skipped a beat. He looked exactly as he always did. Calm, collected, confident. I could see it in his eyes. He had no intention of backing down. His lawyer stood beside him, a man with a sharp suit and an even sharper attitude, his gaze cold and calculating as he glanced at me. I sat up straighter, trying to appear calm, to look as if I had everything under control, but inside I was trembling. I felt so small compared to them, so out of place. My lawyer arrived shortly after, offering me a quiet nod of reassurance. but even that didn't help the whirlwind of fear inside me. The mediator called us into the conference room, and everything else faded away. The room felt like a battlefield. The walls seemed to close in, and the weight of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Robbie's lawyer began speaking first, laying out their case, making it sound so reasonable, so logical. He talked about how Gemma needed stability, how I couldn't provide that with my current situation. He pointed to my lack of financial resources and the instability of my living arrangements. He talked about how much more suitable Robbie was for full custody, how he had the means to provide for Gemma in ways I couldn't. Each word he said felt like a knife in my heart. He painted me as inadequate, as someone who wasn't fit to be a mother. My stomach churned as I listened, but I forced myself to stay silent, to listen without reacting. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath, my hands clammy as I gripped the edge of the table. My lawyer spoke up first, countering Robbie's arguments, pointing out the emotional bond I had with Gemma, how I had been her primary caregiver for so long. He highlighted the fact that I had a stable job, that I was fighting for Gemma's future with everything I had. But even as I heard the words, I felt like they were falling on deaf ears. The mediator was quiet, taking notes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my fight for Gemma was slipping away from me. And then, out of nowhere, Robbie made a comment that cut through everything. If Natalie really cared about Gemma, she would put her needs before her own. She would give her the stability she deserves, but instead, she's making this about her pride, about what's fair to her. The words stung. The accusation was cruel, and for a moment I felt everything I had worked for slipping through my fingers. But then I thought about Gemma again. I thought about her sweet face, her innocent smile, and I knew, deep down, that I couldn't let this man win. I was her mother, and no matter what, I would fight for her. I sat there in that sterile conference room, listening to Robbie's lawyer twist the narrative. Each word felt like a stone being added to the weight already pressing on my chest. It wasn't just a battle for Gemma anymore. It was a battle for my very sense of self. Everything I had fought for, every step I had taken to get here, now felt like it was on the verge of being shattered. But then something shifted. A quiet moment in the midst of all the noise, when the weight of the situation began to feel almost unbearable, I felt a small flicker of something deep inside me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was a kind of quiet, determined resolve that I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about the custody battle anymore. This was about showing the world, and myself, that I could stand on my own, that I could be the mother Gemma needed, no matter what. The mediator finally turned to me. She was a woman in her 50s, tired eyes, but an air of professionalism that had been kind but distant the entire meeting. She spoke gently but firmly. "Natalie," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "I want to hear from you. What do you want for Gemma?" The question hung in the air, and in that moment I realized that I wasn't just sitting here as a victim. I wasn't just reacting to the accusations or trying to defend myself. I was being asked to define the future, to make a choice that was bigger than the legal battle, bigger than any argument over finances or stability. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. I knew I had to be calm, measured. This was the moment I needed to show not just the mediator, but Robbie and his lawyer, that I had something they didn't. I had conviction, I had love, and I had a fierce determination to give my daughter a future that was filled with security, not just in terms of money, but in terms of emotional strength. "I want Gemma to have a future where she feels safe, loved, and supported," I said, my voice shaking at first, but growing stronger as I spoke. "I may not have the wealth or the perfect house, but I can give her something far more valuable, unconditional love, stability in the form of relationships, and a mother who will never, ever stop fighting for her." The words were simple, but they felt like a revelation. For so long, I had been caught up in trying to prove myself through my financial situation, through my ability to meet some impossible standard of perfection. But here, in this room, I realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was the bond I had with Gemma, the relationship we shared, the connection that no one could take away. Robbie's lawyer leaned forward, his expression tight, as if he were about to challenge me, but the mediator cut him off before he could speak. "Natalie, what you've said is important," the mediator said, her tone softening. "But we also need to consider what is in Gemma's best interest. I understand that your financial situation is not ideal and that you've been through a lot. However, we need to determine whether it's feasible for Gemma to live primarily with you, especially considering the stability Robbie can offer her." I nodded, trying to keep my composure. I understand that, but stability doesn't only come from money, I said. It comes from consistency, from emotional connection, from a parent who is present, who knows their child better than anyone else. Robbie might have financial stability, but that's not the only thing Gemma needs. She needs to feel safe in her home. She needs to know she's loved. And I can provide that, even if it's not perfect. There was a long pause as the mediator considered my words. I could see the wheels turning in her head. For the first time in the whole process, I felt like I had control over the situation. I wasn't just defending myself, I was showing who I was as a mother and why that mattered. After a few moments, the mediator turned to Robbie's lawyer. I think we need to reconsider some of the terms we've discussed, she said. This isn't just about finances. This is about Gemma's emotional well-being. I understand that there are concerns about consistency, but we also need to acknowledge Natalie's role in Gemma's life. I could feel Robbie's lawyer tense up, but the mediator didn't back down. She continued to speak calmly, explaining that we needed a more balanced arrangement, one that took into account Gemma's emotional attachment to both parents. I glanced over at Robbie. He was sitting there, quiet now, his arms crossed, his face impassive. For a moment, I saw the man I had known during our brief time together, the one who had promised me a future, the one who had swept me up with his charm. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone who only cared about winning, about control. I knew then that this fight wasn't just about Gemma. It was about me reclaiming the life I deserved, the life I wanted to build for myself and my daughter. Robbie's lawyer made a final attempt to argue for full custody, but the mediator wasn't swayed. After a tense back and forth, the mediator offered a recommendation, a gradual increase in my custody time. She proposed a plan where Gemma would stay with me for 1 weekend a month, with the possibility of expanding to more time as we move forward. It wasn't full custody, but it was a compromise, a chance for me to prove I could provide the stability and care Gemma needed. The relief that washed over me was immediate. It wasn't the perfect resolution, but it was progress. I wasn't going to lose her. I was going to fight for her every step of the way. Robbie and his lawyer were less than pleased, but they had no legal ground to stand on. The mediator had made it clear that the focus was on Gemma's emotional needs, and they couldn't argue with that. As they packed up their things and left the room, I sat there, still processing what had just happened. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but this was a step forward, a sign that maybe, just maybe, I could create the life I wanted for Gemma and me. And that was all that mattered. The weeks after the mediation felt like a strange calm before another storm. On the surface, things seemed to settle. The mediator's recommendations were in place, and Gemma was now spending weekends with me once a month. I felt a small victory, but it was still a fragile one. I had won a temporary arrangement, but the uncertainty of the future gnawed at me. What would happen if Robbie pushed harder? What if he came back for more? I focused on the time I had with Gemma, trying to create memories that were normal, filled with love and routine, something she could hold on to in the midst of all the chaos. I wanted her to feel safe with me, to know that she was wanted and cared for. The weekends we spent together were full of joy, but also heartache. I could see the confusion in her eyes when she asked about her dad, when she asked why she couldn't spend more time with him or why he wasn't around as much. The questions broke my heart. I couldn't explain the full situation to her. She was just a little girl, caught in the middle of a fight she didn't understand. I had to do my best to shield her from the complexities, to show her love, stability, and reassurance. But the reality of the situation was weighing heavily on me. Every time I saw her face, every time she looked at me with trust in her eyes, I felt a wave of guilt. Was I doing the right thing? Was I enough for her? Robbie, on the other hand, seemed to be keeping a low profile. He had backed off from the aggressive tactics he had used during mediation, which was a small relief. But I knew better than to assume that meant he was done. It didn't take long for me to see that he wasn't finished with this battle. His next move came quietly, almost deceptively. One afternoon, I came home to a letter from his lawyer. My heart sank as I opened it, reading through the legal jargon that seemed to grow more complicated with every page. The letter contained a petition for full custody again. Robbie had filed a motion to contest the mediator's recommendation, and now he wanted more time with Gemma. He was requesting supervised visits to begin within the next few weeks, with the end goal of having Gemma live with him for the majority of the year. My blood ran cold as I read the words. I had been expecting this, but nothing could have prepared me for the wave of panic that hit me in that moment. How was this even possible? The mediator had made it clear that my bond with Gemma was strong, that I had a right to be part of her life. But now, Robbie was trying to tear that all away, attempting to manipulate the system in his favor once again. I immediately called my lawyer. I needed to know my options. I couldn't let Robbie take away the small victories I had fought so hard to gain. I couldn't lose my daughter to someone who had never truly been there for her, who had only cared about controlling the situation. "You're in a tough spot," my lawyer said after reviewing the petition. "Unfortunately, because the mediator's recommendation wasn't legally binding, Robbie has every right to petition for full custody. We're going to have to prepare for another legal battle. I'll fight this, but I need to be prepared for him to drag this on." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Another battle, another round of fighting, another round of feeling like I wasn't enough. I didn't know how much longer I could keep doing this. I had to take care of Gemma. I had to be strong for her, but deep down I felt like I was losing myself. I was alone in this, more than I had ever felt before. My parents were still distant, caught up in their own world of blame and guilt, as if I owed them something for everything they had done for me. My dad had been getting more aggressive with his demands, telling me that I had to help them financially or they'd lose their home. He'd even threatened to tell my lawyer that I was financially irresponsible, trying to turn the situation to his advantage. I didn't know how to balance everything. I was caught between the legal fight with Robbie and the emotional weight of my parents' demands. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't focus. I felt like I was sinking under the weight of it all. But one thing kept me grounded: Gemma. I spent every moment I could with her, trying to make up for all the time that had been taken from us. I wanted her to feel loved, to feel safe, to know that no matter what happened with Robbie or my parents, I was there for her. And when I saw her smiling face, I remembered why I was fighting. The days became a blur of lawyer meetings, endless paperwork, and phone calls. But amidst the chaos, I began to feel something stir within me, a quiet strength, one I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew I couldn't let Robbie win. I couldn't let him take away the small moments of happiness that Gemma and I had built together. I would fight for her, no matter how many battles it took. But the fight had only just begun, and I didn't know what the future held. Would I lose Gemma? Would Robbie tear us apart? The uncertainty felt like a constant shadow hanging over me, and I didn't know how much longer I could carry it. But one thing was certain: I wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. I would fight, with everything I had, for Gemma's future and for mine, no matter the cost. The final months of the custody battle were the hardest. Every day felt like I was walking through a storm, unsure whether I was getting closer to the eye of it or being pulled further into its chaos. Robbie's attempts to take full custody grew bolder, and his lawyer became more aggressive, using everything in their power to push me into a corner. But I fought back, and in the end, I realized something fundamental. The battle wasn't just about the legal proceedings or the pressure from my parents. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my bond with Gemma. When the final court date arrived, I felt a mix of anxiety and strength. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, but this time I wasn't going to let the weight of the situation crush me. I sat up straight, my hands steady as I listened to my lawyer present my case. This time, I wasn't just defending myself, I was telling my story. I was telling the world what I had fought for all these years, how I had worked to rebuild my life after everything that had happened with my father, and how I had fought for Gemma every step of the way. The judge was impartial, as he should be, but as he listened to both sides, I could tell that something was shifting in his demeanor. He asked Robbie a few pointed questions about his commitment to Gemma, about his previous absence, and about his ability to provide a stable environment for her. Robbie faltered in his answers, and for the first time I felt a flicker of hope. When the judge finally spoke, his words were clear and final. Gemma would remain with me. The decision was a compromise. Robbie would have supervised visits, but I would retain primary custody. It wasn't the total victory I had hoped for, but it was enough. It was more than enough. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. I had fought for my daughter, and I had won. I hadn't given up on her or on myself. And now, for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. After the ruling, I went home to Gemma. I held her close, feeling the weight of the last few months lift off my shoulders. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she knew she was safe. She knew she was loved, and that was all that mattered. In the quiet moments that followed, I reflected on everything I had been through: the battles, the doubts, the guilt, and the pain. But more than anything, I realized that this journey had taught me a powerful lesson. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about rising every time you do. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth, trying to earn the approval of my father and my family. But now I understood that my worth had never been in question. I was enough. I had always been enough. And as I watched Gemma play, as I watched her laugh and smile, I knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for both of us. The future was still uncertain, still full of challenges, but I had found something I could never lose: my power, my resolve, and the unwavering love I had for my daughter. I wasn't just fighting for Gemma's future anymore. I was fighting for mine too, and I was winning.